Hello Internet and welcome to Historical Headline for the 16th of January. England and Scotland weds. Britain is born. Incest. And we are back in 1707, where the Act of Union took place, gathering together the two crowns of the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Scotland, throwing both of them aside and creating a new kingdom, namely the Kingdom of Great Britain. Yes, it was in fact today in 1707 that Great Britain, as we know it today, was created, even though it took an extra 100 years for the Kingdom of Ireland to also be incorporated into it, and of course then 100 years later the Kingdom of Ireland went away again. While being seen as possibly relevant and at least maybe even necessary, the Union wasn't really considered that much in the Kingdom of England, as they already just considered the Scottish as being part of the King's possessions anyway, since the ruling monarch of England held both thrones as it was, and there was no real chance of anyone taking that away from him. However, the Scottish had completely different opinions on the whole matter and hated the treaty with a passion it took nearly 100 years to fully eradicate, and of course which even today is still simmering under the surface, as the recent elections against or for Scottish independence have shown. However, since the Kingdom of Great Britain became such a factor in world politics and world history up through the 19th century, I figured it would be a good idea to talk about its birth and creation and to talk you through it, and because economics was a very solid part of the original discussions about this, here is our local professor in British history and economics and applied mathematics, Professor Smith-Smythe Winchester.
Thank you, Studio. There had of course been several movements towards greater centralization of the kingdoms of Scotland and England ever since King James became King of England in 1603 upon the death of Elizabeth I. Bringing with him the throne of Scotland, the two kingdoms had basically been united up all through the entire 17th century, and in fact had caused trouble several times, such as when Charles I utilized the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish nation in the Civil War after he had already basically been thrown out of England, and the entire English Parliament was against him, such as Oliver Cromwell and his Roundheads. Now, following the Glorious Revolution of 1688, in which case, of course, the Stuart dynasty managed to escape onto the continent and make war upon England with the help of the French, the British was very interested that the Scottish throne shouldn't possibly be taken away from the King of England and given to some random other person, such as perhaps one of the exiled Stuart princes. The Scottish, on the other hand, were not too fond of this whole matter, but on the other hand, they felt eventually that since they were suffering through such an economic crisis as they were during this time in the early parts of the 18th century, maybe connecting completely with Britain would mean that the British would finally have to actually send some money up to help them deal with their particular issues, and especially after the British promised that the Presbyterian Church, which was so important to the common Scottish folk, would not be forced to be implemented within the Anglican hierarchy that was otherwise dominating the south of the new country. But there is little doubt that money was the most important fact. In fact, the British basically bribed the Scots into agreeing to this thing, distributing more than 240,000 Scottish pounds, almost 20,000 British pounds sterling at the time, to buy important noblemen to speak for the cause of union. The British finally succeeded, and the union took place there in 1707, creating the Kingdom of Great Britain, which should actually probably be called the Queendom of Great Britain, as it was of course the Queen Anne who was currently the complete ruler. This of course also meant that the Act of Settlement now took place in Scotland as well as England, which meant that Catholics were completely forbidden to be on the throne of Great Britain, and thus Scotland was no longer even possible for the Stuart forces, which of course meant that they might have to eventually just sit down in France and do nothing. But to hear what the common people had to say about things, here is some rational and coherent thoughts from our local noblewoman, Lady Caroline McTeague Runkley St. John.
I am not Scottish! How absolutely positively dare you insult me in this fashion, you rude journalist! This reminds me of the time where my neighbour, Lady Bamblebath, argued with her son about marrying an Irishman. It is so offensive to our real British, and my own son, who never comes to visit, so when he was here visiting last week, I complained that I had no grandchildren. But it turns out I have 5 grandchildren, but I can't be expected to keep track of everything, especially since the butcher in the village ran out of sausage, and this is exactly what happens in Scotland in these days, and this would never have happened in the days of my sainted father, even though he is still alive. And this is exactly why coffee has been the downfall of any moral society within modern-day England. Thank you very much to you, sir!
Thank you, Lady Caroline. Short and to the point as always, as is all the British ladies I've ever interviewed. And with this, I must wish a happy congratulation on the newborn kingdom of Great Britain, as we tearfully say farewell to the ancient kingdoms of England and Scotland. Back to the studio.
Thank you, Professor. I am truly sorry to inflict upon you these flowers of Britain's womanhood. Now, despite the hatred for the treaty that was so expressed during those times, Scotland actually benefited quite a bit from it. From an economical perspective, the rewards were manifold. In fact, Scotland was moved out of its economical recession, which has otherwise lasted for nearly 30 years at this point, and into a future that for at least another 150 years was actually completely upwards trending. They maintained their own separate court system. They could seat Scottish people in the House of Lords now. They could seat Scottish people in the Houses of Parliament now. And the removal of internal trade barriers, as I already mentioned, meant that Scotland basically became a integral part of, well, Great Britain and gained quite a lot from it. What it, of course, did not gain was a sense of independence. It was one of those things that all countries eventually seek, and that you can never truly extinguish no matter how you do it, although it took quite a few centuries for Scottish independence movements to get back up to the point where it actually threatened the unity of Great Britain. For England, they gained the security that Scotland would not do any kind of military opposition to them, or to threaten them with military opposition to whatever the British did, because of course now they were one country. They never had to fear that the Scottish Parliament would work against the English Parliament whenever the English and Scottish kings wanted to do something that the Scots themselves were against, and even when the great Stuart invasions came in 1715 and of course in 1745 under Bonnie Prince Charlie, the Union held so firmly that it was in fact more Scots that defeated the Stuart invasions in what should otherwise have been their core lands than it was British army forces. With of course the rising economic power of Scotland, that also influenced the English economical power and finally allowed them to compete fairly with the Republic of the Netherlands, that was otherwise the great economical power in Europe at the time, and allowed Great Britain to take its place as the wealthiest nation in the world, with its trading fleets and armies spreading out across the globe, and eventually of course creating the British Empire, which was the greatest single superpower this world has ever seen. That was the legacy of the Act of Union in 1707, the creation of Great Britain and the birth of the most powerful nation upon the face of the planet up until the rise of the United States of America in the second part of the 20th century. I hope this has been of some interest to you. I shall be back tomorrow with another historical headline. Until then, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all a very happy day.